The people who corrected you the most did not make you smarter. They did not make you more disciplined. They did not make you better. They gave you brain damage, not the kind that shows up on a scan. The kind that shows up in a meeting when your mouth opens and nothing comes out. The kind that shows up at 2 a.m. when you are replaying a conversation from 6 hours ago, rewriting every sentence you said, convinced each one was wrong. The kind that shows up when someone asks you what you want for dinner and your honest answer is, I don't know anymore. That is not a personality flaw. That is not introversion. That is not anxiety, although your therapist may have called it that. What you are experiencing has a name in depth psychology. Carl Jung identified the exact mechanism, not as a metaphor, not as a vague theory, but as a clinical observation with measurable effects, by which repeated correction systematically disassembles a functioning human mind. And the word for what it leaves behind is not cautious. It is not well adjusted. The word is damaged. So why does this happen? Why does correction, something every teacher, parent, and manager believes is helpful, actually make people less intelligent? Because correction does not target behavior, it targets structure. Jung mapped the architecture of the human psyche with a precision that most modern psychology still has not caught up to. And when you examine that architecture, you find that repeated correction does not fix one thing. It breaks 5. It distorts your natural cognitive type, forcing you to think with your weakest function. It feeds a complex that hijacks your conscious mind every time you feel judged. It reverses the flow of your psychic energy, pulling it away from the world and into the unconscious. It calcifies your persona into a rigid mask of compliance until the person behind it atrophies. And it targets your deepest vulnerability, your inferior function, and demands perfection in the one place you were never built to achieve it. 5 mechanisms. 5 forms of damage. Let us go through them one by one. Number 1. The distorted type. You are in a meeting. Someone asks for your opinion. Your gut speaks first. You have an answer. It arrives fast, whole, fully formed. But then the second voice kicks in, the one that has been trained by years of correction. And it whispers, don't say that. Remember what happened last time. Rephrase it. No, actually, don't say anything. And so you sit there, mouth half open, watching someone else say a worse version of your idea, and you think, why can't I just think faster? You can. You used to. Something got in the way. Jung proposed that every person is born with a dominant psychological function. One of 4, thinking, feeling, sensation, or intuition. This is your cognitive mother tongue. It is the function that operates most efficiently, most naturally, most brilliantly. Opposite to it sits the inferior function, your weakest link, the one that operates with the grace of a toddler trying to use chopsticks. When you are repeatedly corrected, what is actually happening at the level of psychic structure is that you are being forced to abandon your dominant function and operate through your inferior one. Jung called this the distorted type. Think about what this means concretely. If you are a naturally intuitive child, someone who sees patterns, leaps to conclusions, grasps the big picture before the details, and your environment punishes you for this by demanding only concrete facts, only step-by-step logic, only show your work. You are being asked to navigate the world with your worst instrument. You are a pianist being told to play with your elbows. And it is not simply that you perform worse, it is that you lose trust in the one faculty that actually worked. The intuition does not disappear. Jung was clear on this. It goes underground. It becomes contaminated by the unconscious. It starts expressing itself in distorted ways, vague anxieties, irrational fears, strange hunches you cannot justify and therefore ignore. Ask yourself, what was the thing I was naturally good at before someone told me it was valuable? Not what you were trained to do, not what you were praised for after you conformed. The thing that came to you like breathing, and that someone, at some point, made you feel ashamed of. That is your dominant function trying to come home. Number 2, the complex eats your mind. Have you ever walked into an exam or a job interview and felt your mind go completely blank? Not because you did not study, not because you do not know the material, but because the moment you sat down, some invisible force, reached into your skull and turned off the lights. You know the answer. It is in there, but it is behind a locked door, and no matter how hard you knock, it will not open. That is not performance anxiety. That is a complex. In Jungian psychology, a complex is not what people casually mean when they say, "Oh, he has a complex about his height." A complex for Jung is a semi-autonomous psychic entity, a fragment of the personality that has split off from consciousness and now operates on its own. It has its own emotional charge, its own memory network, its own agenda, and when it is activated, triggered by a situation that resembles the original wound, it hijacks the conscious mind. Think of it this way. Your consciousness is a boardroom meeting. You are the CEO sitting at the head of the table trying to make decisions. A complex is a disgruntled former employee who storms in, flips the table, and starts screaming about something that happened 3 years ago. While that is happening, no work gets done. Jung documented this with clinical precision. He used word association experiments. He would say a word, and the patient would respond with the first word that came to mind. What he found was staggering. When a word touched on a complex, the patient's response time would spike. They would stammer. They would forget the word entirely. Sometimes they would give a response that had nothing to do with the stimulus. The complex had literally intercepted the signal. Now apply this to someone who has been repeatedly corrected. Every correction, especially from an authority figure, especially during childhood, deposits a small charge into the "I am wrong" complex. Enough corrections and this complex becomes a monster. It does not need the original authority figure to activate. A raised eyebrow from a colleague, a pause before someone responds to your email, the faintest whiff of judgment, and the complex fires. When it fires, it produces what Jung called gaps in memory and blockages in the flow of associations. In plain language, you cannot think, not because you are stupid, because a part of you is busy fighting a war that ended 20 years ago. The next time your mind goes blank under pressure, do not berate yourself. Pause and ask, who am I afraid of right now? Not the person in front of you, the person behind them, the ghost, because the complex does not respond to the present. It responds to an echo. Number 3. Libido regression. The river flows backward. There is a specific flavor of exhaustion that has nothing to do with physical tiredness. It is the feeling of having spent an entire day doing nothing. You did not exercise, you did not create, you did not connect with another human in any meaningful way, and yet you are depleted, hollowed out. As if something inside you has been running a program in the background, consuming all your processing power, while the screen shows nothing but a blank desktop. Jung had a name for this. He called it the stoppage of libido. Now, before you raise an eyebrow, Jung's concept of libido is not Freud. As for Jung, libido is simply psychic energy, the fuel that drives all mental activity, thinking, feeling, creating, relating. In a healthy mind, libido flows forward. It moves outward, toward the world, toward engagement, toward adaptation. Jung called this progression. But when a person's efforts are met with constant obstruction, when every attempt to express themselves is corrected, redirected, shut down, the forward flow of libido stops. Energy accumulates, it pools, and then it does the only thing it can, it flows backward, into the unconscious. Jung called this regression, and regression is not merely a metaphor for going back to being childish. It is a specific psychic event with observable consequences. When libido regresses into the unconscious, it reactivates archaic, primitive psychological material, infantile fantasies. Magical thinking, paranoid defenses, the person begins to experience the world not as a 30-year-old adult with a degree and a job, but through the emotional lens of a wounded 5-year-old. This is why people who have been chronically corrected often display a puzzling inconsistency. They might be perfectly articulate in safe environments, at home, with close friends. But the moment they enter a context that resembles the original corrective environment, an office, a classroom, a family dinner, they regress, they become inarticulate. They stumble over simple words, they laugh nervously at nothing. They agree with statements they privately find absurd. Their intelligence has not disappeared. Their energy has been rerouted, pulled from the cognitive machinery and redirected into an internal war between the conscious mind and the activated unconscious. If you recognize this pattern, articulate in safety, inarticulate under judgment. Understand what is happening. Your intelligence is not failing. Your energy is being consumed somewhere else. The question is not, how do I think faster? The question is, what is my unconscious still fighting? Number 4, the mummified persona. You know those people, maybe you are one of them, who have become so agreeable that they have essentially disappeared. They have no opinions. Or rather, they have all opinions, whichever one is needed at the moment. You ask them where they want to eat, and they say, whatever you want. You ask them what they think about a political issue, and they mirror the room. They are not stupid, they are not apathetic. They are performing a survival strategy so thoroughly that they have forgotten it is a performance. Jung called this the persona. From the Latin word for the mask worn by actors in ancient theatre, the persona is the face we show the world. It is necessary. We all wear one. The problem arises when the persona calcifies, when it stops being a flexible social tool and becomes a prison. Now, point 1 explained how correction forces you to think with the wrong function. This is different. This is not about how you think. This is about whether you are still there to think at all. In the case of the repeatedly corrected individual, the persona becomes hypertrophied. It grows massive, rigid, all-consuming, because every correction teaches the same lesson: who you are naturally is not acceptable. Become what we want. And so the person constructs an elaborate mask of compliance. They become the model student, the agreeable co-worker, the child who never causes trouble. But here is what the correctors never see behind that perfect mask. The actual personality is atrophying. Jung described this state with devastating precision. A person so identified with their persona becomes a spiritual mummy, a hardened remnant of what they could have been. They lose what Jung called natural spontaneity, the ability to respond to the world directly from the core of who they are, without first routing every thought through the filter of, is this acceptable? And this is where the becoming dumb manifests most visibly. Independent thought requires access to your own instincts, your own feelings, your own pattern recognition. When the persona has sealed all of these off, when every thought must first be sanitized through the compliance filter, the processing speed drops catastrophically. It is not that the person cannot think, it is that every thought must pass through customs, and customs is backed up to the horizon. Consider this: the next time you catch yourself about to say, I don't know, or whatever you think, pause, not to manufacture a strong opinion you do not have, but to notice that automatic compliance is not politeness, it is scar tissue. Beneath it, there is a voice. It is faint. It has been faint for years, but it is there, and the only way to revive it is to let it be wrong sometimes, to let it speak without immediately correcting it yourself. Number 5, the hell of the inferior function. There is a particular kind of suffering that comes from being forced to do the one thing you are worst at, not once, not as a challenge, but perpetually as the standard by which your worth is measured. Imagine a fish being judged on its ability to climb trees, and not just judged but corrected every time it fails. Fins are not for swimming. They reef for gripping branches. Try harder. This is not a hypothetical. This is what happens when repeated correction targets what Jung called the inferior function. Jung's student Marie-Louise von Franz called the inferior function. This is the function opposite to your dominant one, the area where you are constitutionally, irreducibly, permanently clumsy. Not because you have not tried, because it is the nature of psychic structure. For a dominant thinking type, the inferior function is feeling. They will always struggle, to some degree, with nuanced emotional expression. For a dominant intuitive type, the inferior function is sensation. They will always have some difficulty with concrete details, physical awareness, step-by-step processes. Von Franz was clear: the inferior function is not merely slow. It is very slow and awkward, and it does not obey conscious intention. You cannot will it into competence. You cannot drill it into mastery. It operates at the speed of the unconscious, which is to say, on its own schedule, in its own way, or not at all. When repeated correction targets the inferior function, when a feeling type is relentlessly told their logic is sloppy, when a sensing type is punished for not seeing the big picture, the result is not improvement. The result is what von Franz called a psychological inferno. The person enters a state of chronic failure, not occasional failure, not the productive failure of learning, but the grinding, inescapable failure of being asked to do something their psyche is not built to do, and being punished for the inability. And here is the cruelest twist. This is where the damage from all 4 previous mechanisms converges: the chronic failure, the constant shame, the accumulated sense of I am fundamentally defective It does not stay contained to the inferior function. It bleeds into the dominant function. The person stops trusting their strengths. They second-guess their best instincts. The complex from point 2 activates. The energy from point 3 reverses. The mask from point 4 thickens. Everything collapses inward. They become, in a very real sense, dumber across the board, not because any cognitive capacity has been lost, but because the confidence required to use those capacities has been obliterated. Ask yourself this: what is the thing you have been trying to fix about yourself for years, maybe decades, that never gets better no matter how hard you try? Consider the possibility that it was never meant to be fixed, that it is not a flaw in your design. It is the shadow cast by your greatest strength, and the energy you are spending trying to correct it, that energy belongs somewhere else. At the beginning of this video, I used the words brain damage, and I meant them not because I wanted to shock you, although I did, but because polite language has been protecting the people who did this to you for long enough. Constructive criticism, high standards, tough love. These are the euphemisms. The clinical reality, as Jung mapped it, is structural interference with the natural development of a human psyche. Your type was distorted. Your complexes were fed. Your energy was dammed and forced backward. Your persona was inflated until the person behind it starved, and your deepest wound, your inferior function, was selected as the one area where you were required to be perfect. Jung understood something that most of the modern world still does not. Intelligence is not obedience. Intelligence is not the ability to conform your thinking to someone else's template. Intelligence, real intelligence, is the capacity to engage the world through the fullness of your own psychic structure, with your dominant function leading, with your shadow acknowledged, with your inferior function accepted, not as a deficiency, but as the price of having a strength at all. The people who corrected you, most of them were not cruel. They were themselves corrected. They were passing down the only pedagogy they knew: reshape the child until the child fits the mold. They did not understand that the mold was always the wrong shape, because every mold is the wrong shape. Because you were not meant to be molded. You were meant to individuate, and if you recognize yourself in any of what we have discussed today, if you are the person whose mind goes blank under judgment, the person who has lost trust in their own instincts, the person who has spent years trying to fix the one thing about themselves that was never broken, I want you to hear this clearly: you are not stupid. You were never stupid. You were damaged. And the fact that you are still here, still trying to understand what happened to you, that is not weakness. That is your psyche refusing to die. If this resonated with you, if you want to go deeper into the psychology that the surface-level self-help world refuses to touch, subscribe to Thus Spoke Psyche. We do not do inspirational posters here. We do not do 5 easy steps to happiness. We go into the basement, we turn on the light, and we see what is actually there. I will see you in the next one.